Dawn crawls slowly over Guadalcanal. A thin mist clings to the jungle canopy, drifting in pale ribbons above a humid world that still smells of gunpowder and ruptured earth. The cicadas have not yet begun their morning cry. For a brief moment, the island is quiet, too quiet for a place where thousands fight to the edge of starvation every day. Near a patch of shattered palms, smoke rises from the twisted frame of an A6M Zero. Its once sleek fuselage is torn open, the white paint scorched black, the rising sun insignia barely visible beneath ash and mud. A single parachute lies tangled in the brush nearby, half buried in the dirt. And beside it, a young Japanese pilot struggles to lift his head. His vision blurs. His flight suit hangs loose over a body worn thin long before the crash. For days he has eaten almost nothing. For weeks he has lived on the edge of collapse. Now, with one arm broken and his strength nearly gone, he can no longer move. Boots rustle somewhere ahead, American boots, moving cautiously through the undergrowth. The pilot exhales, defeated. He expects the end. Instead, he is about to encounter something profoundly different. A moment that will lead directly into the wider story of how hunger, strategy, and humanity collided on Guadalcanal. The crash at Guadalcanal did not occur in isolation. It was the result of a chain of decisions, shortages, and strategic calculations that had been building for months, long before the young pilot ever climbed into his Zero for the final time. By mid-1942, the Japanese Empire had stretched itself across the Pacific in a sweeping arc of victories. From the Philippines to Malaya, from Hong Kong to the Dutch East Indies, Japan seemed unstoppable. Yet every expansion came at a cost: extended supply lines, overworked pilots, and fuel expenditures the nation could barely afford. The Pacific was wide, and Japan's industrial base was small. Each mile of conquest strained its limits further. Into this tightening vice came one island, Guadalcanal. In August 1942, American Marines landed on the island and seized an airstrip the Japanese had only just begun to construct. They renamed it Henderson Field. That single strip of land changed the Pacific War. Whoever controlled Henderson could dominate the sea lanes around the Solomon Islands. Whoever lost it risked losing the entire southern front. Japan understood this. The United States understood it even more. What followed was not simply a battle. It was a grinding, months-long ordeal where hunger and exhaustion killed nearly as many men as bullets and bombs. For the Japanese, the struggle to retake Guadalcanal quickly became one of desperation. Their supply convoys could not operate by day, so the Imperial Navy resorted to rapid nighttime runs, the infamous Tokyo Express. Destroyers raced down the slot, unloading what little they could before retreating at dawn. But these runs brought only fragments of what the Japanese forces needed. Rice was scarce. Medicine ran out entirely. Ammunition arrived in small, uncertain batches. The Japanese garrison began to starve, and the air crews supporting them suffered even more. By October, Japanese pilots flying from bases at Rabaul, Buin, and the Shortlands were already on the brink of physical collapse. Many lived on half rations. Others received only a handful of rice balls per day. Meat was almost non-existent. Some pilots wrote in their diaries that their hands shook violently when gripping their controls. Others noted that they could barely stand during pre-flight briefings. Yet the missions continued. Orders continued. Sorties continued. The Imperial Navy needed to crush Henderson Field. Every available aircraft, regardless of pilot condition, was thrown into the effort. Across the lines, the Americans faced their own hardships, but the contrast was stark. U.S. supply lines, while strained, remained intact. Cargo ships brought food, ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements. Marines on Guadalcanal often lived on sea rations and hardtack, but compared to their Japanese counterparts, they were well fed. They could rely on medical aid, steady logistics, and a constant rotation of fresh troops and supplies. This imbalance shaped everything that happened in the skies above the island. Japanese pilots flew long, dangerous missions over open ocean with insufficient fuel, little sleep, and almost no nutritional strength. Losses mounted. Planes crashed not only from combat but from sheer exhaustion. Some pilots blacked out mid-flight from hunger. Others simply failed to return, their aircraft disappearing into the dark waters of the Solomon Sea. By late 1942, the Japanese command grew increasingly desperate. Every sortie was a gamble, and every pilot was a dwindling resource Japan could ill afford to lose. Still, the missions were ordered. Still, the pilots took off. Still, the effort to retake Guadalcanal drove men to the breaking point. It was in this context, amid starvation, strategic urgency, and the relentless demands of a crumbling supply system, that one specific pilot received his orders for what would become his final mission. A mission flown on an empty stomach, from an overworked base, in an aircraft pushed to its limits. And as he lifted off into the heavy tropical air, the stage was already set for the crash that would bring him face to face with the Americans and lead to one of the most unexpected encounters of the entire campaign. Life at the forward Japanese air bases west of Guadalcanal was deteriorating long before the young pilot climbed into his cockpit for the last time. The war had expanded too quickly, stretching Japan's logistics far beyond their intended limits. Fuel stocks were dangerously low, spare parts were scarce, and trained aviators, once the pride of the Imperial Navy, were being lost faster than their replacements could be trained. At ground level, the picture was even worse. Many airfields lacked proper refrigeration or storage, so food spoiled almost as quickly as it arrived. Some pilots survived on little more than dried fish and a handful of rice. Others reported days when they received no meals at all. Their bodies, accustomed to rigorous diets back in Japan, began to thin, muscle mass faltered, stamina evaporated. Even basic immune defenses weakened, making pilots prone to fevers and infections. Yet morale remained outwardly stoic. The Imperial Navy expected absolute devotion. Weakness was concealed behind forced smiles. Meanwhile, the Americans on Guadalcanal had transformed Henderson Field into a functional fortress. Engineers worked day and night to repair bomb craters. Anti-aircraft guns covered the perimeter. Fresh aircraft, Wildcats, Dauntlesses, and later, the rugged P-38s, rotated through the base. And every week, supply ships risked the journey to bring ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, and most importantly, food. For the Japanese pilots flying from Rabaul or the Shortlands, this disparity was painfully clear. Their missions required long overwater flights, often at the edge of fuel endurance, while American fighters could take off from Henderson with full tanks and return within minutes of combat. Japanese aircraft were still formidable. The Zero remained agile and deadly, but its advantages were slowly eroding under the weight of attrition and inadequate logistics. By late October 1942, Japanese commanders knew they had to break the stalemate. Reinforcements were planned. Strikes were intensified. Every surviving pilot was needed, even those who could barely stand. Thus came the order for the mission that would seal the young pilot's fate. He was stationed at a makeshift base, one where the tropical heat warped wooden crates, where mechanics worked bare-chested in the dust, where the thin smell of petroleum mixed with the sharper scent of sweat and malnutrition. On the morning of his mission, he rose before dawn, though rose was hardly the word. He pushed himself upright from a straw mat, legs trembling, vision still hazy from sleep and hunger. Breakfast was meager. A small rice ball, a sip of weak tea. Some pilots received nothing at all. He ate quickly, as if speed could somehow add weight to the meal, but his body remained hollow and he knew it. Still, he reported for briefing, standing among men who looked equally drained, cheeks sunken, uniforms loose, eyes shadowed. The maps were laid out. Targets were marked. The objective, as always, was Henderson Field. American strength had to be weakened. Their aircraft had to be destroyed on the ground. The Japanese army needed air superiority to attempt another major offensive. The pilot saluted, bowed, and walked to his waiting Zero. Mechanics had done what they could. The aircraft was fueled just enough for the round trip, but no more. Ammunition was rationed. A minor oil leak had been patched with scrap material. The airframe bore signs of repeated strain, its once precise engineering now held together by improvisation. He climbed into the cockpit, feeling the metal hot beneath his hands. The engine coughed to life, sending a tremor through his underfed body. He steadied himself, tightened his harness, and pushed the throttle forward. As the Zero lifted into the sky, the world below shrank into a patchwork of jungle, sea, and thin smoke rising from distant fires. The air vibrated with engine noise. The horizon shimmered in the growing heat. He settled into formation, surrounded by other aircraft containing men just as exhausted, just as hungry, just as aware that the odds were tilting steadily against them. Their mission was necessary. Their mission was dangerous. Their mission might not bring them home, but they flew on because that was the order. Ahead lay Guadalcanal, Henderson Field, and the moment when his life would collide with the enemy in a way no one expected. The young pilot was not unique. His story mirrored the physical decline of nearly every Japanese aviator operating in the Solomon Islands. These men had once been among the most highly trained pilots in the world, graduates of a demanding pre-war program that accepted only a small fraction of applicants. Their skill had stunned American forces during the first months of the Pacific War, but skill alone could not carry them through starvation. By the time of the Guadalcanal campaign, the Imperial Navy was feeding its air crews less than enough to maintain basic health, let alone combat readiness. Pilots lived on a constant caloric deficit. They pushed aircraft to the limits while their own bodies weakened day by day. Fatigue became a constant companion. Stomachs cramped from emptiness. Ribs became visible beneath flight suits. Some pilots described moments of dizziness while climbing into their cockpits. Others admitted that during long flights, especially those lasting 2 or 3 hours over open sea, they fought to stay conscious. But none dared refuse a mission. To do so would be to bring shame, dishonor, and possible punishment. They concealed their weakness behind discipline. This human cost rarely appeared in official reports. Japanese records emphasized bravery, sacrifice, and duty. But beneath those words were real men, shrinking in weight, hollowing in spirit, yet still obeying every order. The pilot who crash-landed on Guadalcanal was one of these men, another life pressed between duty and deprivation, flying into danger on an empty stomach. And as the campaign intensified, the pressures placed on men like him only grew heavier. Japan's strategy in the Solomon Islands was built around necessity and desperation. Henderson Field had become a thorn embedded deep in the empire's southern flank. As long as American aircraft operated from that airstrip, Japanese troop movements through the slot remained vulnerable. Attempting to reinforce Guadalcanal became a nightly gamble. Thus, Japanese high command ordered continuous airstrikes, sometimes several per day. They hoped to bomb Henderson Field into uselessness, ground the American aircraft, and open a corridor for reinforcements. But sustaining this pressure required pilots who were already near collapse. Every mission carried enormous risks. To reach Guadalcanal, Japanese aircraft flew long distances from bases like Rabaul, fighting fatigue and fuel constraints. Many planes arrived with barely enough fuel for a few minutes of combat before turning back. Pilots often flew knowing they would have almost no margin for error on the return trip. Meanwhile, the Americans were flying shorter distances from the well-defended Henderson Field. Their fighters, particularly the Grumman F-4F Wildcat, were slower than the Zero but rugged and well-supported by radar-guided interceptions. Japanese pilots faced coordinated American defenses each time they approached the island. Losses began to mount steadily. The Zero remained agile, but starvation and exhaustion dulled reflexes. A fraction of a second lost in reaction time could mean the difference between life and death. Dogfights became more unforgiving. Even skilled pilots made mistakes, yet commanders continued the pressure. Every sortie aimed to weaken Henderson Field enough for a decisive ground assault. Every attack pushed the Japanese air arm closer to collapse. For the pilot who would soon crash, this tactical reality meant one thing. No matter how weak he felt, his presence in the air was deemed essential. Every available aircraft, every remaining pilot had to fly. And as conditions worsened, this tactical necessity began to take on a moral dimension. Guadalcanal itself was an adversary, one that punished both sides mercilessly. The island's jungles were thick, hot, and swarming with insects. The heat rose like a physical weight during the day. Tropical rains fell so heavily they turned soil into rivers of mud. The environment devoured men, machines, and supplies with equal indifference. For a wounded pilot, crash landing on Guadalcanal was a descent into a world of hazards. Venomous snakes hidden in the brush, razor-sharp cone grass, sudden drops in the jungle terrain, near impossible visibility beneath the canopy, aggressive insects that infected even minor cuts. American Marines struggled with these threats daily, despite having supply lines and medical support. For a Japanese pilot, usually alone, often injured and already starving, the jungle might as well have been another enemy soldier waiting to finish what the crash had started. Survival was brutally difficult. A crash rarely left a pilot unscathed. Broken limbs, concussions, burns, and lacerations were common. Even pilots who landed intact often found themselves disoriented, dehydrated, and surrounded by unfamiliar terrain. Some died within hours from heat stroke. Others collapsed from blood loss or infection. And beyond the natural dangers were the fears, deep, indoctrinated beliefs that Americans would torture or execute any captured Japanese airmen. Many pilots carried pistols or grenades with the intention of taking their own lives to avoid capture. The young pilot on Guadalcanal faced all of these realities at once: starvation, injury, jungle isolation, and the overwhelming expectation of a violent death at the hands of the enemy. Yet fate would deliver something entirely different, something that defied his training, his beliefs, and everything he'd been told about the Americans waiting beyond the tree line. And this unexpected turn begins where the next set of perspectives unfolds. The A6M Zero was an engineering marvel when it first appeared in 1940. Lightweight, agile, and capable of astonishing range, it outclassed every Allied fighter during the early war years. Its turning radius was unmatched. Its climb rate shocked American pilots, and its long-distance performance made it ideal for operations across the vast Pacific. But the Zero's strengths were also its weaknesses. To achieve extreme maneuverability and range, Japanese designers had removed armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. This left pilots exposed. A few rounds of .50 caliber fire could ignite the Zero's fuel system and send the aircraft spiraling into flames. American Wildcats and later Airacobras could take punishment the Zero simply could not. By the time of Guadalcanal, the technological gap was widening. While the Zero remained dangerous in the hands of skilled pilots, the Americans were learning its weaknesses. Avoid turning fights. Use diving attacks where the Zero's fragile airframe struggled. Force it into high-speed maneuvers it couldn't sustain. Exploit its vulnerability to damage. Radar also gave the Americans early warning. Japanese formations frequently found Wildcats already climbing to meet them, guided by observers who tracked every incoming raid. For the young pilot flying on an empty stomach, technology became an invisible opponent. His aircraft, once perfected for Japan's early war triumphs, had become increasingly outmatched, and his own malnourished body could no longer extract the Zero's full potential. Starvation dulled reaction time, weakened control input, and slowed mental processing, all fatal traits in high-speed combat. Japan still relied on the Zero because it had no immediate replacement. But the aircraft's reliance on pilot skill made every weakened aviator a greater liability. The plane could no longer compensate for the failing human element behind the controls. When his Zero finally descended toward Guadalcanal, its technology could not save him. Not from damage, not from hunger, not from the weight of months of attrition. But the contrast between Japanese and American machines would soon be overshadowed by a deeper, more human contrast, one born from leadership and doctrine. Leadership in the Pacific War was defined not only by strategy, but by how each side valued its men. Japanese command placed extraordinary expectations on pilots. Bravery was assumed. Sacrifice was expected. Survival was secondary. In the rigid hierarchy of the Imperial Navy, the idea of rotating exhausted airmen home for rest was unthinkable. Pilots were weapons, and weapons were used until they broke. Orders were delivered with unwavering certainty: fly, attack, endure. There was little room for protest. American leadership viewed its aviators differently. While the U.S. military certainly demanded discipline and courage, it also recognized that a trained pilot was a valuable resource. R&R rotations, medical care, steady meals, and psychological support were prioritized. Healthy pilots performed better, and on Guadalcanal, where the air war was relentless, American units fought hard to preserve both machines and men. This divergence in philosophy shaped every sortie. Japanese pilots, weakened by lack of supplies and rest, were pushed into missions that would have grounded any Allied squadron. Commanders accepted staggering losses, believing that determination alone could overcome hunger and technological decline. The Americans took the opposite approach: preserve capability, sustain manpower, and maintain long-term strength. Thus, by the time the young pilot's Zero was crippled over Guadalcanal, the very systems designed to support him had already failed. Leadership had driven its airmen beyond any human limit. Ironically, the care he lacked from his own side was waiting for him with the enemy. And that irony deepens when we consider the most profound angle of all: the moral and psychological gap between the two sides. War in the Pacific was shaped by ideology as much as strategy. Japan's Bushido-inspired doctrine taught that surrender was dishonorable. Captivity was worse than death. Pilots believed they would be tortured or executed if captured by Americans. Many carried grenades to kill themselves before falling into enemy hands. American soldiers, in turn, had their own fears, fueled by brutal battles, propaganda, and the knowledge that Japanese troops rarely surrendered. Encounters were often violent because neither side expected mercy from the other. And yet, when the starving pilot crashed on Guadalcanal, the Marines who found him faced a choice. They saw not a fearsome enemy warrior, but a wounded, dehydrated young man barely able to lift his head. His bones were sharp under his skin, his lips were cracked, his hands trembled involuntarily. Instead of pulling the trigger, they lowered their rifles. This moment revealed a quiet truth of the Pacific War. Even in one of the conflict's most brutal theaters, humanity flickered unexpectedly. American medics treated him without hesitation. They cleaned his wounds, splinted his arm, and offered water. When they handed him food, real food, heavier and richer than anything he had eaten in weeks, his reaction surprised them. Some accounts describe Japanese POWs weeping quietly upon tasting their first full meal in months. It was not just nourishment, it was dignity. It was the first genuine kindness he had encountered in a long time. This single interaction complicated the narratives taught on both sides. For the Americans, it was a reminder that the enemy was often a victim of his own command's indifference. For the Japanese pilot, it was a shock that challenged everything he had been told. And it set the stage for the moment when fate, exhaustion, and battle converged into the crash that changed his life. Morning broke clear over the Solomon Sea when the young pilot's formation approached Guadalcanal. From the cockpit, the island looked like a dark green mass rising from the blue ocean, peaceful from afar, deadly up close. Thin columns of smoke marked artillery positions. The faint glint of metal revealed aircraft parked around Henderson Field. Beneath the silence of altitude, he knew the Americans were already watching. He tightened his grip on the control stick. His arm trembled, not from fear, but from the hollow weakness that had settled into his body after weeks of inadequate rations. Even turning his head produced a flash of dizziness. Still, he pressed on. His orders were clear. As the formation descended, American radar operators tracked them, guiding Wildcats up to intercept. The first glints of sunlight off climbing aircraft signaled the beginning of yet another furious encounter in the skies above Guadalcanal. Then the chaos erupted. Wildcats burst upward from Henderson Field in tight, aggressive formations. Their engines growled as they climbed into firing position. The Japanese pilots broke formation to engage, spiraling into a deadly dance where reaction time meant survival. The young pilot banked sharply to avoid an early burst of .50 caliber fire. The maneuver cost precious energy. Sweat dripped into his eyes. His body felt slow, as if trapped in molasses. His Zero responded quickly, but his muscles lagged behind its demands. A Wildcat passed beneath him. He rolled to pursue, but a sudden wave of lightheadedness forced him to steady the aircraft instead. He blinked hard, trying to clear his vision. Not now. Not here. Another American fighter came at him from the right. He veered left, narrowly avoiding a burst of tracers that cut across his path. His heartbeat thudded unevenly in his chest. The strain of high-G turns on a malnourished body was almost unbearable. Then the moment came. An unseen Wildcat dove in from behind. The American pilot, guided by radar vectors and experience from many such encounters, lined up cleanly. A brief, controlled burst struck the Zero's right wing and engine cowling. The aircraft shuddered violently. Oil sprayed across the windscreen, blurring everything into black streaks. Smoke billowed from the engine. He was hit, and badly. Instinct took over. He pulled back gently, climbing just enough to escape immediate pursuit. But the damaged engine coughed, sputtered, and began to fail. The aircraft lost altitude quickly. Flames licked the underside of the fuselage. His flight instruments flickered. He knew instantly he would never make it back to base. Below him stretched the brutal jungles of Guadalcanal, thick, tangled, and unforgiving. A crash in that mass of green meant almost certain death. The thought of capture flooded his mind, echoing every warning he had ever been given. Americans take no prisoners, Americans torture, Americans kill on sight, but he had no options left. Smoke filled the cockpit. His lungs burned. His vision blurred again, this time from heat and panic. The aircraft sank lower, skimming treetops that whipped violently in the prop wash. He spotted a narrow opening, a thin gash of lighter green amid the jungle canopy. It was not a clearing, not really, but it was the closest thing he would find. He cut power, leveled the wings, and braced. The Zero slammed through the undergrowth. Metal screamed. Branches tore into the fuselage. The aircraft skidded, lurched, and then snapped violently as the wing caught a tree trunk. The impact hurled him forward into his straps. Pain shot through his arm. He felt the bone break as clearly as if he had heard it. His head struck the canopy frame, leaving him momentarily dazed. When the world finally stopped moving, silence settled in. Only the ticking of cooling metal and the distant hiss of leaking fuel broke the stillness. He tried to move. Pain erupted. His arm hung limp. His ribs ached with every breath. The cockpit canopy jammed on the first attempt to open it, but he forced it with his good arm until it finally gave way. He dragged himself out, collapsing onto the forest floor. Dirt and ash clung to his uniform. He crawled a few meters before his strength gave out completely. The jungle loomed around him, dark, humid, alive with unseen creatures. He waited for death. Hours passed. Then came the sounds. Voices, boots crushing leaves, the clatter of equipment. American voices. His heart pounded. He tried to reach for the pistol at his belt, not to fight, but to follow the expectation drilled into him since training. But his hand could not even lift. A shadow fell across him. A helmeted figure stepped into view, rifle raised. Another Marine moved to his other side. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, glinting off their gear. The pilot looked up, expecting the final moment. Instead, one of the Marines lowered his weapon slightly. "Easy, he's hurt." The words were foreign, but the tone needed no translation. More Marines gathered. One knelt beside him, checking his broken arm. Another offered water. Their faces showed caution, but also something the pilot had not expected from the enemy: restraint. And in that fragile moment, lying on the forest floor, he realized that everything he had been told about American brutality was about to be challenged by reality. A discovery that would deepen even further in the hours to come. The Marines moved carefully, aware that a wounded enemy pilot might still carry a sidearm or grenade. But the young Japanese aviator made no attempt to resist. He couldn't. His body had reached its limit long before the crash. Now even consciousness slipped in and out like a tide. Two Marines lifted him gently, surprised at how little he weighed. His uniform felt thin, almost brittle. When they hoisted him onto a makeshift stretcher, they could see the outline of his ribs through the fabric. "He's starving," one of them muttered. The pilot didn't understand the words, but he recognized the tone. It wasn't anger. It wasn't hatred. It was concern, an emotion he had not associated with the enemy. They carried him through dense brush toward a company aid station. The jungle air pressed heavily on them, thick with humidity and the lingering smell of engine smoke from the morning's air raid. Now and then, the pilot felt the stretcher shift as Marines paused to check for movement or listen for danger. He expected rough treatment when they arrived. Instead, he found himself under a canvas tent, shaded from the sun, surrounded by medics who quickly assessed his condition. A corpsman cut away part of his sleeve to examine the broken arm. Another cleaned the gashes along his forehead. They worked quickly, not gently, but efficiently, the same way they would have treated one of their own. He winced with pain, but what struck him more than the sting of disinfectant was the absence of cruelty. No one struck him. No one shouted. No one mocked him. They were focused only on stabilizing him. Then someone placed a metal cup to his lips. Water. Cool, clear, refreshing. He drank greedily until the medic pulled it back, warning him not to take too much at once. The pilot did not understand the words, but he recognized the gesture. A restraint meant for protection, not punishment. Next came food. A Marine brought over a small tin of rations, soft bread, fruit, and a few bites of meat. The smell alone overwhelmed him. His stomach cramped with anticipation. For a moment he hesitated, unsure if this was a trick. It was. The medic helped guide the first spoonful toward his mouth. He tasted real nourishment for the first time in weeks. The bread was dense and warm. The fruit sweet. The meat rich enough to bring tears to his eyes. His hands trembled so violently that he could not feed himself. The Marine continued, offering slow bites so he wouldn't choke. The pilot's breath shook as he swallowed each mouthful. Part of him felt shame. His training insisted that accepting food from the enemy was a betrayal, a stain upon honor. But hunger was stronger than ideology. And the simple act of being fed by the people he'd been taught to hate felt strangely disorienting, even disarming. To the Marines, he was no longer a threat. To them, he was just another young man broken by war. They spoke softly among themselves, their words floating past him as he drifted in and out of consciousness. "Poor kid's half the weight he should be. Looks like he hasn't had a square meal in a month. War's rough on everybody, ain't it?" Though he couldn't understand their English, he sensed the meaning from their tone, the compassion, the disbelief at his malnourished state, the recognition of shared humanity. Hours passed as they stabilized him. A doctor examined his arm, confirmed the fracture, and splinted it carefully. They cleaned the burns from the crash. They changed his bandages. They fed him again, slowly, cautiously, giving him more calories in a single afternoon than he had received from the Imperial Navy in a week. As twilight settled over Guadalcanal, the Americans prepared to transport him to a rear area holding point. The jungle echoed with distant rifle fire and the hum of insects beginning their nightly chorus. Before they moved him, a Marine knelt beside the stretcher. He held out a canteen and spoke a few quiet words, something the pilot didn't understand, but the tone was unmistakably reassuring. The young aviator stared back, confused. He had been taught that Americans were monsters, brutal, merciless, without honor. But the men around him were young, tired, dirty, hungry in their own ways, but capable of kindness, capable of empathy, capable of seeing him not as an embodiment of the enemy, but as a human being who had suffered. It shattered something inside him, an idea planted since boyhood, reinforced through training and repeated in every briefing. And in its place came a realization that lingered with haunting clarity. The enemy fed him better in a single day than his own command had in weeks. As night enveloped the island, the Marines lifted his stretcher once more, beginning the trek toward the rear lines. Crickets sang. The distant rumble of artillery thudded along the horizon, and for the first time since taking flight that morning, the young pilot felt his body relax. He had survived the crash. He had survived the jungle. And now, against every expectation, he was being cared for. This turning point, this profoundly human moment amid one of the Pacific's most brutal campaigns, set the stage for the aftermath that would follow. Night settled fully over Guadalcanal by the time the stretcher team reached the rear perimeter. Lanterns flickered under canvas awnings, casting long, wavering shadows across the medical station. The air smelled of iodine, damp soil, and the faint metallic tang of blood. Wounded Marines lay on cots under mosquito netting. Some slept. Others stared silently into the dim light, lost in their own thoughts. Into this space, the young Japanese pilot was carried. The American personnel did not treat him differently from the others. They followed the same procedures: triage, hydration, wound cleaning, temperature checks. A nurse's assistant, barely older than the pilot himself, placed a blanket over him. A doctor examined his broken arm again, ensuring the splint was properly secured. They recorded his injuries, estimated his condition, and made notes for the intelligence officers who would arrive later. But even during these assessments, the overarching focus remained simple: stabilize the man. As the pilot rested, the first wave of clarity returned to him. His mind drifted between fragments of memory: the roar of the engine as it failed, the sudden burst of gunfire that struck his aircraft, the violent crash in the jungle. But now those images blurred with others: a Marine's steady hand feeding him, a medic's careful movements, the unexpected gentleness in enemy voices. His stomach still ached, not from hunger now, but from the shock of receiving more calories in a few hours than he had consumed in days. Yet the pain was almost welcome. It meant survival. It meant his body was beginning to wake from starvation's fog. Early the next morning, intelligence officers came to speak with him. They brought an interpreter, one of the few available Japanese Americans attached to Pacific units. The interpreter's presence alone startled the pilot. He had not expected to see another Japanese face in captivity. The officers asked simple questions at first: name, rank, squadron, base of operation. The pilot responded cautiously. He had been taught to resist interrogation, to provide nothing that could aid the enemy. But his weakened state stripped away some of that rigidity. His answers were clipped, basic, but truthful. It wasn't the content of his responses that surprised the Americans. It was his condition. Reports from Guadalcanal had already indicated that Japanese troops were suffering from severe malnutrition. But seeing it firsthand, on a naval aviator, supposedly among the best supported men in the imperial forces, confirmed something far more serious. One intelligence officer later described the encounter in a report. The prisoner displayed signs of extreme undernourishment, body weight far below standard, muscle loss significant. This reflects systemic shortages among enemy air units. Another noted how quickly the pilot fatigued during questioning. After only a few minutes, he began to sway, his eyes glazing with exhaustion. The interpreter asked for a pause. The officers agreed without hesitation. His condition was simply too fragile to continue. They ordered that he be fed again before any further questioning. As the pilot ate, slowly, carefully, he studied the Americans around him. Their uniforms were worn. Their eyes were tired, but they moved with energy he had not seen among his own comrades in months. Their hands were steady, their faces fuller, their steps firm. Even the enlisted men seemed stronger and healthier than many Japanese officers he had known. It was not just the food. It was the system behind them, a logistical machine that delivered everything from medical supplies to fresh coffee across thousands of miles of ocean. He realized then what Japan's pilots had sensed but rarely admitted. They were fighting against a nation that could sustain war at a scale Japan could not hope to match. Meanwhile, his own peers, men he had trained beside, flown with, slept beside in cramped barracks, were still launching missions on empty stomachs, trusting a command structure that expected miracles from starving bodies. He did not know their fate, but he feared he knew the answer. The Marines, observing him quietly from their posts, made their own conclusions. They had fought the Japanese long enough to recognize determination. Yet this prisoner revealed a deeper truth, one that hinted at the strain cracking Japan's war machine. The pilot's survival became more than a single human story. It became evidence of a collapsing supply chain, a failing strategy, and a military pushing its men beyond human limits. A reality that would only grow clearer in the days ahead. In the days that followed, the young pilot's condition steadily improved. American medical staff increased his rations gradually to prevent shock. They replaced his bandages, monitored his temperature, and checked his wounds for infection. His strength returned slowly, first in small ways, like the steadiness of his hands, then in more visible signs, such as the fuller look of his face and the clearer focus in his eyes. The Marines watched these changes with a mix of curiosity and reflection. They had seen Japanese soldiers fight with relentless intensity, often choosing death over surrender. Yet this pilot, frail and shaken, represented a different aspect of the enemy, one shaped not by fanaticism alone, but by deprivation. New intelligence reports began circulating through American command. They noted the malnutrition of the prisoner, the poor condition of his gear, the worn state of his uniform, and the limited ammunition recovered from his crashed Zero. Analysts compared these findings with other reports from the front. Starving Japanese patrols, wounded soldiers lacking medical supplies, entire units reduced to foraging for roots and insects. Japan's logistical crisis was becoming undeniable. On Guadalcanal, American forces captured diaries from dead Japanese soldiers describing empty rice sacks and failed resupply missions. Some wrote about eating palm roots. Others mentioned going to battle with only a handful of bullets. Combined with the testimony of the captured pilot, a grim picture formed. The Japanese war effort in the Solomons was collapsing from within. Meanwhile, the pilot's presence in the American camp began challenging assumptions held by both sides. Some Marines were surprised to see how young he was, hardly older than many of them. Others were struck by how politely he behaved, bowing slightly even with one arm immobilized. A few attempted brief conversations through gestures or the occasional translated phrase. They weren't friends, but they were no longer faceless enemies. For the pilot, the transformation was even more profound. He saw the Americans share cigarettes with each other, pass around tins of coffee, and joke quietly during breaks. He observed their discipline, their camaraderie, their access to food and medicine. They were not the barbarians he had been taught to expect. They were simply soldiers, fighting with the support of a nation that could sustain them. It forced him to reevaluate everything he understood about the conflict. He later told an interrogator, in halting Japanese filtered through an interpreter, that he had expected to be beaten or executed upon capture. The Americans recorded his words, noting the disbelief he expressed at receiving medical treatment and full meals. One report summarized, "Prisoner appears emotionally struck by humane treatment. States he was given more food in one day here than in the last 10 days under Japanese command." His astonishment reflected a deeper truth. Japan's military, consumed by its doctrine of sacrifice, had pushed its men to a point where basic survival was uncertain. By contrast, the Americans recognized the value of keeping prisoners alive, not only for intelligence, but because humanitarian treatment strengthened morale and aligned with the Geneva Conventions. As the weeks passed, the pilot was transported to a more permanent POW facility. There, he met other captured Japanese personnel, aircrew, sailors, and soldiers, all of whom shared similar stories of hunger, exhaustion, and disillusionment. Some were surprised to be alive, others were relieved, but nearly all were struck by the difference in living conditions. They received 3 meals a day. They were permitted medical care. They were treated with a basic dignity absent from much of their wartime experience. For many, it was the first time they realized the scale of Japan's logistical failures. Beyond the camp, the war on Guadalcanal continued to grind forward. American forces steadily closed in on the remaining Japanese strongholds. By early 1943, after months of staggering losses, Japan ordered a full evacuation of the island. Starved, diseased, and battered troops boarded destroyers in desperate nighttime runs, the Tokyo Express making its final runs not to reinforce, but to save what remained. The pilot learned of this evacuation months later. He listened quietly, understanding that the island he had crashed upon had been lost, abandoned not in defeat, but in necessity. Japan's war machine had reached its breaking point, and he, in his unexpected survival, had witnessed that collapse from both sides. His post-war fate varied depending on the historical record one follows. Some Japanese POWs returned home and lived quietly, while others faced suspicion or ostracism. But one constant remained. He never forgot the moment the enemy fed him, healed him, and treated him better than the command he had once vowed to die for. His story became one of the small, humane threads woven into the vast, brutal tapestry of the Pacific War. And from this aftermath emerges a deeper reflection, one that stretches beyond battles and borders. War is often remembered for its violence, its battles, its destruction, its long shadows of grief. But sometimes, in the midst of brutality, a single moment of quiet humanity lingers long after the gunfire fades. The young Japanese pilot's capture on Guadalcanal was one of those moments. He entered the war shaped by an ideology that demanded sacrifice and rejected surrender. He flew missions on an empty stomach, carried by a belief that duty outweighed life itself. His commanders praised endurance but offered little care. His nation expected unwavering devotion while providing dwindling means to survive. Yet when he crashed, broken and starving, the hands that reached him first were not those of comrades, but those of enemies. The Marines who found him had endured their own hardships, malarial fevers, sleepless nights, relentless attacks, but they still recognized the frailty before them. They saw a young man worn thin by hunger and fear, and they responded not with violence, but with medical aid, food, and simple decency. In doing so, they revealed a truth that outlives military strategy or national allegiance. Human suffering, when witnessed up close, often dissolves the boundaries drawn by war. For the pilot, the realization was profound. The enemy he had been trained to hate had preserved his life. The institution he had sworn to serve had nearly consumed it. His experience became a quiet testimony to a broader contrast in the Pacific War, a contrast between systems, doctrines, and the value placed upon individual lives. It underscored the resilience of compassion, even in places defined by suffering, and reminded both sides that dignity can survive even amid destruction. Guadalcanal remains a symbol of endurance and sacrifice. But hidden within its history are human stories, small, fragile, enduring, of mercy given when least expected. Stories like his, because sometimes in the darkest chapters of conflict, the most lasting